Welcome to the Society for Research in Child Development lecture series on child development in a diverse majority society. My name is Martha Zaslow, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of Society for Research in Child Development, or SRCD. I was honored to be present for the first lecture in this series, and it is my honor to provide you with a brief introduction to the purpose and history of the series. In terms of purpose, it is expected that by 2044, the United States will become a majority-minority society, with non-Hispanic whites comprising less than half of the US population. Children are leading the way. In 2020, children in the United States under the age of 18 became majority-minority. The terminology itself is becoming outdated, so we refer instead to diverse majority. The idea of the SRCD lecture series grew out of discussions of the SRCD Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee on ways that SRCD could inform this historical transition. The goal is to draw upon research in order to foster positive, inclusive approaches to engender self-respect and respect for others, increasing opportunities for healthy development and success in all children and youth. Each year, SRCD invites distinguished scholars who are conducting research in this critical area to deliver the annual lecture. In terms of history, the inaugural lecture in this series was co-hosted by the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia in July of 2018 in anticipation of the one-year anniversary of the tragic events associated with the White Nationalist March in Charlottesville in August of 2017. The inaugural lecture was given by Joanna Lee Williams, Associate Professor at UVA. Professor Williams summarized research indicating how and why bringing students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds together in school contexts is beneficial and addressed the obstacles that inhibit the realization of such benefits. Last year's lecture was given in April of 2019 by Emily Smith, professor at the University of Georgia. Professor Smith's lecture focused on preparing racial ethnic minority children for STEM opportunities by promoting identity and efficacy in community after-school programs. Last year's lecture was co-hosted by the College of Family and Community Sciences at the University of Georgia. Videos and slides from both of these really important lectures are available on SRCD's website. Look for these in the chat function. Look for links to these in the chat function. The video for today's lecture will also be available at the SRCD website in a few weeks. Turning now to today's lecture, SRCD is grateful to SRCD's Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee for co-organizing today's lecture, together with the organizers of the SRCD Special Topic Meeting, Construction of the Other, Developmental Consequences and Applied Implications of Prejudice and Discrimination. SRCD conveys special thanks to Linda Halgenseth, who is active in both groups and coordinated across these in making today's lecture a reality. I am delighted now to welcome Dr. Cynthia Garcia-Cole, who will provide an introduction to today's lecture, the third in the series aimed at using research to support children and inform those who care for and work with them as we transition to a diverse majority society. Thank you.
So thank you, Marty, for your introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and delighted to be able to introduce this particular event. As we all know, we're living in unprecedented historical moments, needing scientifically based understanding and evidence-based solutions for our most pressing problems. Even before the eruption of Black Lives Matter, many of us were cognizant of the destruction of our social fabric as a country by the deeply embedded personal, institutional, and systemic racism in our country. The new wave of overt expressions of racism shocked many of us who had thought that laws, regulations, and historical knowledge had really worked in moving us into a pluralistic society as envisioned by many. We have been shocked witnessing the depth of hatred, of finger pointing, of exclusionary policies that have galvanized our country in our recent past. For that reason, SRCD and a group of us, Linda Halgenseth, Lisa Lopez, Gustavo Carlo, and Norma Perez Brena worked on organizing a special topics meeting that was going to take place in May 2020 in Puerto Rico on the topic of the construction of the other. Because of the pandemic, our conference was canceled and moved to spring 2022. But in the meantime, we felt like that we needed to keep this important conversation going. And so we're very grateful to be co-hosting this webinar today with the SRCD Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee. We also plan to offer an SRCD biennial meeting pre-conference on this topic on Tuesday, April 6th of 2021. And we're also looking forward to many presentations during the actual virtual biennial meeting. So stay tuned for that matter. So today's webinar, entitled Constructing the Other, Two Complementary Perspectives on Discrimination, Social Exclusion, and Inequalities, come about because of the present historical moment and because of our commitment as social scientists to address this issue. The phrase, the construction of the other, captures the basic social cognitive processes that underlie the development of prejudice, bias, and discrimination. The construction of bias against members of other social groups and the behaviors against others. Although these processes can underline exclusion, bullying, and violence against other groups and individuals based on other socially constructed dimensions like sex, gender, sexual orientation, social class, religion, etc. Today, we're going to zero in on race, ethnicity, and immigration status. The two main presenters today, Dr. Deborah Rivas-Drake and Dr. Melanie Killen, and I smile because I know them very well and I'm very pleased to be introducing them themselves, have dedicated their academic research and public life to documenting, among other things, how children develop racial and ethnic bias, how children develop coping strategies within the self to protect themselves from prejudice and discrimination, and how to change these detrimental attitudes toward others. Our discussant and moderator, Dr. Lauren Mims, is an emerging scholar in these areas, and their bios should be shown in your screen shortly. The first presentation is entitled, When the Goal is Racial Justice, Learning from Youth, Families, and Educators by Professor Deborah Rivas-Drake. Dr. Rivas-Drake is a professor of education and psychology at the University of Michigan, and one of the overarching goals of her work is to illuminate promising practices that disrupt racism and xenophobia and that help set diverse young people on trajectories of positive contribution to the school and communities. The second presentation is entitled Developing Inclusive Youth, Harnessing Social Cognition About Exclusion to Reduce Prejudice and Bias by Professor Melanie Killen. Dr. Killen is Professor of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland. Dr. Killen is currently the PI of an NIH-funded randomized controlled trial to test the effectiveness of her team's Developing Inclusive Youth web-based curriculum tool designed to reduce prejudice and promote intergroup. She has many different and diverse interests, but she will be talking today on the origin of racial attitudes, prejudices, and biases, and the possibility of changing such attitudes and ensuing behaviors. Each of the main speakers will talk for about 30 minutes, and be sure that you can send, and be sure to be sending them, your questions, comments throughout the presentations, so we can be handling them at the end of the two presentations. Our discussion of these two presentations will be led by Professor Lauren Mims. Dr. Mims is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at Ball State University Her current work focuses on promoting the well-being and development of Black students, exploring how the sum total of schooling influences student identities. And this research also explores student-teacher relationships, dream keeping, which I love that phrase, and the consequences of bias and discrimination. Her discussion of the papers and the moderation of your participation in this webinar will last about 30 to 40 minutes. I hope that you're all very excited as we are today in embarking in these particular topics. Professor Rivas-Drake, you're on.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that introduction. I'm so honored to be here. I want to thank the ERI committee, the construction of the other planning committee, Cynthia, Linda, Marty, and the SRCD folks who made this possible, Jessica, Julia, Jill, and Gabby. I also want to thank Melanie and Lauren for sharing this experience, and I look forward to a fruitful conversation later on about issues that I know we've been thinking about for a long time. So here's the roadmap. Oh, here's the roadmap for today. It's gratifying to be giving this talk at a time when we're moving in the field towards centering racial justice in the field of child development. And I'm happy to be sharing just one perspective or approach on how to do that work. And of course, it's one of a perspective. I'll start by providing my view of the problem and its scope, and then approach the approach that I've taken that reflects my perspective in over the past 20 years, including my graduate years, and drawing from several projects with varying methodologies over the past 7 years in particular, that really highlight the importance of identifying assets within communities that help them not only to cope, but also challenge injustice. And then I'll provide some examples of what we can learn and what we have learned about those assets from listening to youth, families, and educators. So in the field, we hear a lot about diversity. We've been hearing about it for a while. And indeed, the title of this lecture series really highlights the realities that we're all likely aware of on this webinar. And a lot of that, right, has to do with the changing demographics. In my talks and book, I've pointed out trends such as the fact that our changing demographic landscape assures that today's kindergartners are growing up in a world that we may not recognize, even just my generation. And that's the world that they're going to be parents, neighbors, employees, and voters in. And we've been hearing a lot about that aspect as well in the last few weeks and the election cycle. But if we only focus on the narrative of diversity or primarily focus on the narrative of diversity, we miss a few critical things. And that is that these youth are also simultaneously growing up in a more diverse world and contributing to it, but also continue to be exposed to trauma, to their person and very existence and questioning of their very existence. And this exposure starts from very young in early childhood, where youth are exposed to proximal policies and practices meant to reject who they are and their presence, right, in spaces and in the US. And they're also sometimes meant to convey rejection of their literally rejection of their physical bodies, right, of themselves, their bodies. And they also are exposed to messages that convey political precarity or worse, threats that are meant to harm psychologically and sometimes invite physical harm to their person. And that these issues really happen everywhere, as in this headline is just an example of like a situation that emerged in my own backyard in a town outside of Ann Arbor. And so no one is exempt from these realities. New York, I like to say New York's not exempt, LA is not exempt, and everywhere in between is not exempt. So while we've hoped for possibly this idealized view of diversity, and that's sometimes what we might think of when we hear about it, what we actually live with is what Beverly Daniel Tatum has called a smog that contaminates really and obscures the possibility of what that diversity could be. And there's a phrase that I've heard a lot recently that I think bears repeating now in this moment, and that is that this smog is exactly who we are. And that brings me to my first point, which is that if we are going to address the problem, we need to name the problem as such. We need to explicitly acknowledge that this is who we are, that smog is the smog, you know, the air that we breathe. And in doing that, I'd like to offer one working definition of racism that comes from Naomi Priest and her colleagues in Australia that I appreciate. And they state that racism refers to a phenomenon that results in avoidable and unfair inequalities in power, resources, and opportunities across racial or ethnic groups, can be expressed through beliefs, emotions, behaviors, and practices. And xenophobia is a related but distinct phenomenon. UNESCO defines it as attitudes, prejudices, and behavior that reject, exclude, and often vilify people based on the perception that they are foreigners. UNESCO further clarifies that xenophobia derives from racism. And I think what's really important to note at the outset is that both are about subjugation and subordination. So as I was thinking about this issue and the air, right, the smog, I was thinking about a young person who's currently 15 years old. And what do we know about the broader landscape of ethnic and racial relations over the course of that hypothetical 15-year-old's life? And just for my own edification, to start to think about this, I looked at hate crimes over that person's life, specifically hate crimes motivated by race, ethnicity, or ancestry. This is not for the faint of heart. I don't recommend doing this. But it was illuminating. So as you can see here, what we see simply is just that in every year of this hypothetical 15-year-old's life, the majority of hate crimes reported in the US are motivated by race, ethnicity, and ancestry. The vertical black line that you see is the point at which this young person transitions to early adolescence or the second decade of life. Another way to think about racism and young people's experiences with racism is to look at what they tell us in surveys and polls. One survey conducted by NPR and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, for example, found that the majority of Asian American, Native American, Latinx, and Black Americans, respectively, believe that there's discrimination against their group in the US today. Recent reports by a variety of organizations shed additional light on the perspectives of practitioners, parents, and youth themselves. For example, immediately after the 2016 election, which was permeated with vitriolic anti-immigrant rhetoric, the Southern Poverty Law Center obtained 2,500 reports of specific bias incidents. And as you can see here, many of the incidents referenced anti-Black comments, terms, images, as well as anti-immigrant comments and things like referencing building the wall and deportation. In the fall of 2018, they went back into the field about 4 months into the academic year, and they asked roughly 2,800 educators if they had witnessed hate and bias incidents in that school year. And 2/3 had witnessed at least one incident. Of those 1/3 were race and ethnicity related, and almost 1 in 5 were related to anti-immigrant bias. They also scanned media reports for such incidents and found that 67% of hate and bias incidents reported in the media that year were motivated by issues of race, ethnicity, and immigrant status. So earlier I showed you a poll of adults. Here's a poll of a survey of 15 to 24-year-olds conducted by MTV and PRI. And this shows us that over 70% of young people say there's a lot of discrimination against Black people in the US today. And over 60% believe that Latinx people face a lot of discrimination as well. This same report tells us that youth are experiencing it themselves. So here we see that over 70% and large majority of these groups say these youth personally had experienced discrimination or witnessed someone experience racial discrimination. So vicarious exposure in the past 12 months. And this accords with some of the work by Eleanor Seaton. In my own work, I've focused on interpersonal racism experiences and exposure. For example, in the Teen Identity Development and Education study, We assessed 3 different types of discrimination at 3 time points over the course of 1 year. And today I'm showing you just the report of Latinx youth in that sample. And our latent growth curves for this analysis show a significant increase in both school and community exposures. And I'm just showing you here what the prevalence looks like. And so we see increases in both exposure to discrimination perpetrated by adults at school and adults in the community, and a stable reporting of discrimination perpetrated by peers, which also is in line with previous literature on this topic. In a separate study, we assessed both perceived discrimination and foreigner objectification experiences over 3 years this time, and this is between 2014 and 2016. And we see significant increases. Again, slope coefficient is significant in these analyses. We see increases in both. And foreigner objectification refers to experiences that convey perceived foreigner status, and it's a way to kind of get at xenophobic encounters. We wanted to know more about all of the individual experiences that we asked about in these scales. And so we simply plotted, the prevalence of each item. And what you can see here is that in every single item that we asked about, there's an increase between 2014 and 2016 in youth reporting having been exposed. So for example, the item here called Go Back, what that is telling you is that in 2014, about 42% of our sample had reported ever hearing the comment, go back to where you came from. Whereas in 2016, about 61% reported hearing that. We also see that increases in perceived ethnic racial discrimination were significantly associated with perceiving more future racial and ethnic discrimination in future occupations over time. And the pattern was similar for perceived foreigner objectification over time. And so this means that these experiences in adolescence are associated with youth's sense of their life chances in the future. Which brings me to a second point, and that is that defining the problem also includes naming the harms. So let me tell you a little bit more about what we know about that. In a couple of meta-analyses, but I'm highlighting the work of April Benner and E.J. Wang today, we see that there's evidence that exposure to ethnic racial discrimination is associated with more depressive and internalizing symptoms, less positive, things like less positive well-being and self-esteem, worse academic adjustment, including achievement, and more externalizing behaviors and engagement in risky sexual behaviors, for example. There's a lot more I could say about the harms. But putting this evidence of interpersonal racism together with the realities of structural racism, it's probably not surprising that in 2019, the American Academy of Pediatrics formally recognized racism as a child public health crisis. And yet, although these harms in psychological, socio-emotional, academic, and health domains are evident and they're real, we also know that youth, families, and communities have strengths on which they draw to navigate this broader social landscape, and that these experiences do not define these communities. The two that I want to focus on today to get the conversation going are cultural and civic and political, potentially, assets that we're starting to really look at and unpack in our work in the lab. The two frameworks that I use to guide my work have always, so that's the integrative model by Cynthia Garcia-Cole and her colleagues, and PVES, or the phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory by Margaret Spencer and her colleagues, and the elaborations that have also been offered recently. But these two frameworks really have always centered the experience of oppression and things like racism in the development of youth. But at the same time, they've juxtaposed that reality with the agency that youth, families, and communities have to navigate, cope with, and challenge the reality. So it's been present in the theories that I've worked with and have guided my work from the beginning. I spent my career really focusing on those assets and capacities and how can we keep fostering them. And the first step to doing that is to adapt, I say, an asset-based perspective and drawing from the communities themselves. So one of these assets is ethnic racial identity. And in this example. There's a lot of different evidence for this, but this is a meta-analysis from 2014. And in other meta-analyses that preceded and also came after this one, we see similar patterns that it can serve as a promoter factor. This particular meta-analysis focused on the role of feeling positively about your ethnic or racial group. So really having a sense of pride or positive regard. And so what we see is that I really love this one, thinking about the discrimination meta-analysis and kind of juxtaposing it with this meta-analysis, what we see is the opposite trends, right? So like the ethnic racial identity here really serves to promote positive outcomes and also is associated inversely with negative outcomes such as depressive symptoms and other psychosocial outcomes, positively associated with things like self-esteem, well-being, and positive social functioning, which includes interacting with peers, positive academic adjustment, including achievement, and less engagement with risky behaviors and endorsement of such attitudes. Another question that has emerged in the literature is, to what extent is ethnic racial identity, or ERI, protective? So how much does it mitigate or attenuate the negative associations that we see between discrimination, exposure, and adjustment? So is it a buffering factor? And the long story short of it is that it depends. For some components like exploration and regard, there's not consistent evidence that that's the case. But for things like commitment, which refers to a sense of belonging, connection to your group, there is, and that comes from this very recent meta-analysis by Tiffany Yip and E.J. Wang and their colleagues. So this is this and in other, our own findings and kind of thinking about this for a number of years, has raised a question for me, and a question in terms of how ERI is supposed to inform youth thinking about discrimination and just kind of broader social marginalization more generally. And a question that we've been working on for several years is really, how does ERI intersect with or become interconnected with youth emergent political understandings and knowledge? Some of this actually emerged from hearing what youth were saying in open-ended questions about the meaning of their ethnicity and if anything had happened to change their thinking. And this effort was just a wonderful foresight by my former student, Tiziana Camacho, and a current analyses that are being led by Stephanie Miller-Tejada. And here's just an example of what one adolescent wrote initially. So she says, "I'm proud to be Mexican, even if white people, some not all, might think that we're not as smart or as equal to them. I love my ethnicity. I love the foods, culture, people. Some white people out there want us to go back to our country. I guess they haven't tried our food. I am proud of my ethnicity and I wouldn't change. It is the best." And so what you see here is a clear, right, like understanding or sense of negative public regard, what we call public regard in the field. And that's just the societal or other evaluations of your ethnic group. And in this case, they're negative. But what I really love about this quote that has always resonated with me is that this young person immediate, like interwoven into that articulation of that negative public regard is a sense of pride and love. And these like affective words really highlight that. And that refers to private regard, but we also are seeing here sort of like the endorsement of private regard as a way to resist that negative public regard that she's aware of. As we went, from 2014 to 2016, youth were also making astute observations about the broader socio-political climate in these open-ended responses, including these kinds of statements. So this young person said, "To me, ethnicity means that I have an amazing history and that the families, traditions, music, and other people that surround me have something to show me. Being Latina also means that during these controversial times, I must pay close attention to what is occurring politically, as it will affect me and others. The past year has made me come to a realization that the way people view my ethnic group is usually negative. Due to many political problems with race, I now have a stronger belief to represent my ethnic group and be more proud than ever." And this young person referred specifically to the news. So the news has sort of made me feel stronger about my ethnicity because I feel like I have to defend what I am. In later years, they also, as they started moving to the election cycle, started referencing the election of Donald Trump specifically as an event that had led them to further understand the role of ethnicity in their lives. For example, this person simply said, "Trump and the government want us out of our country." And I really love the use of the word "our" because it's a reclamation of something that they're being told is not theirs. And nothing really happened in the past year, except for Donald Trump calling Mexicans rapists, drug lords, and troublemakers. Part of the process, we think, by which youth's ERI becomes linked to their emerging political and civic dispositions can be found in cultural and political lessons learned at home. We think that this is one mechanism by which Latinx youth learn to reject the vitriol to which they are exposed. One way we've observed this in our data is in the context of a mixed method project that involved parents and adolescents in Southeast Michigan. And these analyses were led by my former student, Fernanda Cross. The following examples highlight the role of the broader socio-political context. And I think, there's a lot that we're writing about all the different types of socialization that the parents were engaging in, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is that these messages about the broader political context are actually coupled with messages around cultural socialization. And the reason that they're brought into the conversation, into these conversations with their youth, is that they need to do it, right, in order to help their children navigate and make meaning, really interpret that broader context that they're already being exposed to, as you'll see in this first quote, by talking to their peers. So this mother said, I noticed it was important that they understood everything I talked to them about when they were younger. So that when they're younger, they started realizing in school, they talk to their friends about their fathers being undocumented or having been deported, and they start to get curious. I tell them how the situation is so they don't start creating their own conclusions. Parents also prepare their children in part by responding to what children were directly or indirectly observing in the news. For example, this mother said, she understands now because every time we've heard news of someone who was taken, she comes and tells me, Mommy, I have a friend. He told me his parents told him that so-and-so was taken away and that someone was taken. Yes, and she saw it on the news. So the point here is really that they are helping their children to understand and make meaning of the experiences, the proximal experiences, and those broader political messages. 2 years ago, we embarked on another longitudinal mixed method study in Chicago this time to describe the role of social emotional learning, youth's ethnic racial assets, including identity and the messages they were getting from home, as you'll see, and their emerging civic development, so their sense of themselves as community and civic actors. Here, youth were younger, 10 to 14 years old, so a bit younger than that last study. And we're still learning, but to date, I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're learning. In our Latinx sample of about 274 kids in 3 schools, average age is about 12 here. The overwhelming majority were saying that they're taught to feel pride and have knowledge in their ethnic heritage. The majority said their parents discuss current events with them. The majority also are saying that their parents or adults in the community, that they've witnessed them take action to correct injustice. And they've also said that they themselves feel that they could have a positive impact on their communities. So we explored what youth said about these discussions at home involving current events and issues facing their community, the cultural heritage, and warnings that they might encounter unfair treatment themselves due to ethnicity or race. And in this analysis led by my student Bernadette Pineta, I want to zoom in on a few key aspects. First, we found that among these younger youth, as you can see, socio-political discussions have the potential to inform adolescents' awareness of social inequities, as well as their future civic dispositions. The youth who reported talking with their parents about political issues at home, including unfair treatment and news items, for example, and those who received cultural socialization and preparation for bias were saying that they were engaging in more identity exploration, and they expected to be involved in turn in their community when they were older. In addition, receiving more cultural socialization and having these socio-political discussions were uniquely and directly associated with youth's sense that they wanted to be involved in their communities right now, at this point in their life. One of our other major aims of the project is to explore what educators can do, if anything, to leverage these cultural assets and civic assets and really foster civic assets in youth in the context of schools in ways that, again, support their civic development. And for this piece of the project, we interviewed and observed teachers And we're finding I want to give you a sense of like a few different principles guiding practice that I think illuminate how educators can use to have opportunities in school to engage in these in leveraging these assets. And this is all what you're going to see is consistent with, I think, the literature on, culturally sustaining and critical, schooling for critical consciousness, as Scott Sider and Darren Graves have shown, and it comes from a case study. So the first principle has to do with centering youth's lived experiences and identities. For example, we observe, teachers supplementing to ensure that the youth are represented in the curriculum, as in this observation. So this teacher stated to the students, I chose this book because it's a collection of short stories about the lives of Latino youth growing up in the US, and I hope you can relate to some of the characters in the stories. The second principle has to do with validating students' experiences of oppression. And for example, this example is really illustrates their desire to make space and their willingness to make space to discuss these issues, and that were issues that the youth in this case saw as community level trauma. So they were discussing ICE raids and deportation and being pulled over by police and a sense of restricted mobility and not being able to move about the city freely. And the teacher, instead of shutting it down, engages and says, there are so many people living through similar things, and almost everyone knows people are struggling with these kinds of issues, but no one ever talks about them. We know all of these things are happening, but we don't talk to them. We don't check up on people, and we learn and read stories, but we read it and that's it. We don't talk about it. And then she proceeded to make the space for them to unpack it and think about the emotional ramifications of this community level trauma. Finally, an extremely powerful approach that we've observed is when teachers encourage youth to use their voice for change. And this involves explicitly telling youth that they have a powerful voice to share with the world, as in this example. You have a powerful voice and need to let others know that you care. Todos ustedes son líderes. You are all leaders, and your voices have the power to enact change in your community. So as I consider the question, how do youth learn about discrimination, which was the part of, I think, of this discussion that I was contributing to for this lecture, I'm reminded and was reminding myself that this is the outcome that we really want to see. And from my perspective, the response to that question then is first and foremost that youth learn by exposure themselves vicariously through their interactions in institutions and indirectly or directly through the media. As they make meaning of these experiences, we see what Gin Wright argues is the role of adults encouraging conditions that ultimately build the capacity of youth to resist social marginalization. And they're doing this by drawing on the experiences that they're having with adults and peers, which I didn't talk about today, but really making meaning of those experiences. And he argues that it's these community connections and this emerging political consciousness and together with cultural identity that really supports kids' capacities to resist and reject marginalization and to be change agents. The socialization literature really suggests that it's important to the ethnic racial socialization literature, and I think civic socialization as well, that it's really important to consider the messages that youth are receiving about racism, race, ethnicity, et cetera, and immigration status in the context of family, school, peer, and community settings. And just to raise some possibilities, you can see that you can learn everything from evading, avoiding, right, rationalization of these experiences. You can learn strategies or be taught or encouraged to affirm who you are and your identities, receive clarification. There's a lot of different things that can be happening in this space for youth to be making meaning of these experiences. And you can actually explicitly give tools, strategies, and provide models of how to navigate these experiences. And ultimately, my research and that of my collaborators and colleagues in the field suggests that we all have a role to play in building these capacities, because ultimately what youth are learning is how to respond. And for some, it's an issue of developing an accurate awareness. For others, it's coping. For some, it's resisting. And another important question is about acting in solidarity with others. And with that, I'd like to express gratitude to my own community of scholars in the CASA lab, my students and colleagues and collaborators, schools, families, and youth who participate in all the research we do. Of course, the funders, the WT Grant Foundation, and NSF. And I'd like to conclude by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you as a faculty member at the University of Michigan, which was founded when the Anishinaabe Alliance of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighboring nations, ceded portions of their land so that their children could be educated here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the work that you've done and that you continue to do. Now I want to transition it over to our second presentation here from Dr. Killen.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present this invited lecture today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I really want to thank Linda Halgeseth and Gabriella Stein for organizing this lecture series as well. And I am really looking forward to all the questions and discussions and really feel honored to be part of this. Thank you. The title of my talk is Developing Inclusive Youth, Harnessing Social Cognition about Exclusion to Reduce Prejudice and Bias. Around the world, children experience unfair treatment, discrimination, and inequality. And children are both the victims and the perpetrators of unfair treatment. This may seem counterintuitive because we often think of children as victims, and of course they are, and this is very serious. But children are also the perpetrators of unfair treatment, sometimes explicit, but sometimes more implicit in ways that they aren't aware of. I want to correct a few misconceptions about prejudice before I get into more aspects of prejudice and some of the research. First, we often hear that children are colorblind and not think about race. This really is not true. We have a lot of research that shows that children can identify their own and others' race from early in life and become aware of status and bias early in childhood. This is really important to recognize because if you think that children are colorblind, then there's not a problem to solve. We don't have to address it. But we do. There is a problem, and this has to be addressed and dealt with over time. We hear that children learn prejudice from adults. Again, it's not fully true, it's partially true. But peer groups and societal messages perpetuate power hierarchies that often target other children to maintain status. And of course, we know that for some children, they have parents who will have negative expectations and they may adopt it. But for some children, they're going to reject their parents' negative attitudes. And it can go the other way. You can have parents who are really thinking and hoping they're egalitarian, but their children are not going to be. So this is not a direct relationship in the way we often think. We hear that children are unaware of inequalities and prejudice. They don't think about it. It's part of the adult world. They're not aware of it yet. But in fact, they are. Children become very aware of prejudice early, but they also hold biases unbeknownst to them. So they want to rectify inequalities. There are times where they want to do that. We want to harness that. For those children who understand that and see that, how can we encourage that? And for those children who don't yet, to help them along that way. We also hear that children are self-oriented and do not care about fairness, equality, and equity. Children just think about themselves. They want more for them. They want to, they take some time. You have to socialize them. They don't really understand fairness yet. You've got to really teach that to them. But it's actually not the case. Children really care about fair and equal treatment. And unfortunately, sometimes they think about it with their own group and they may not extend it to the other group, and that's an obstacle. We don't really have to teach them fairness. It comes in so early, but we have to help them get over obstacles that might exist for them to apply it to their everyday interactions. As we know, there are long-term negative consequences to experiencing unfair treatment, discrimination, social exclusion in childhood and adolescence. And these are related to depression and anxiety, stress and developmental delays, low academic motivation, social withdrawal, sleep disorders. There's been a lot of very important research on the physiological basis of what happens when you experience discrimination. And this really has to be out in the public. We have to be able to express this more and talk about this because the consequences are so great. It's also the case, though, that individuals who perpetuate bias also have long-term negative consequences in terms of stress in school and the workforce. We don't often think about it, but it's also there. Rudy Mendoza-Denton and some of his colleagues at UC Berkeley had college students who were paired with a dorm mate and of a different race. And they did an intervention study because they found that these students had very high stress, both white students, Black students, students of ethnic minority backgrounds. And they did an intervention study where they had them go through a friendship experience, and they found that the stress really was reduced for all of the students following this kind of intervention. There's a lot of other kinds of problems, of course, for individuals who perpetuate bias because they're not going to be comfortable. The world is multicultural. As soon as they get into different kinds of settings, they're going to experience people who are different from them. So we have to address this. Experiencing prejudice is a global health problem. Reducing prejudice and bias has positive benefits, not just for the health of individuals, which is so important, but for societies and nations. There's research showing that wealth inequalities are highly related to health disparities. And we know that wealth inequalities are very much, unfortunately, confounded with race and ethnicity. So this is a very large problem that has to be dealt with. Developmental science plays a crucial role regarding reducing prejudice and bias in childhood. There's been a lot of research, an outpouring of research over the past 20 years or more, and this has really been important for trying to understand all the pieces of the puzzle. I'm going to talk today about some basic research and an intervention study to address this. So I'm going to talk about what is prejudice, what do we know about it in childhood and adolescence, and what types of interventions might reduce prejudice. So what is prejudice? Assigning traits, intentions, interests, and abilities to individuals based solely on group identity. She's an American, so you know they'll be very blankety blank. They always are like that. We don't want her in our group. This is actually a complex statement. There's negative attitudes, biases, and exclusionary behavior based on group identity. We really have to understand this and unpack it. How early does prejudice emerge? It depends on how you measure it. There's no one prejudice test. When prejudice research first started more than 20 years ago, Frances Abood was one of the leaders of this. She created a trait attribution measure, and it basically you had different kinds of adjectives. You know, somebody's nice or clean or mean or dirty, and you showed them pictures of kids of different races. And the kids did associate positive attributes to their own, somebody who looked like themselves, and negative attributes of somebody who looked different by race and ethnicity. But that's one way to look at it. Prejudice is a very complex construct. And since then, there's been a number of many different ways to look at it and to try to understand its complexity in everyday life. I'm going to give just a few examples. You know, you hear stereotypes. Kids talk about stereotypes. Girls can't play with us because they'll just cry. In-group preferences. We get to play this game because you guys can't even speak English. Exclusion. We don't let Muslims in our group. They don't know how to play kickball. These are the kinds of things that are happening every day at recess and playground and schools. And we really have to address this. Hasn't been directly addressed in the way that it needs to be and warrants. And there are also explicit and implicit forms of prejudice. These are very explicit ones. Kids are saying things very explicitly, but there's a lot of ways in which these kinds of ideas are communicated indirectly, implicitly. There's been a lot of really important research on implicit bias in childhood. We need to integrate these areas as well together to understand it in everyday interactions. Prejudice is a systemic issue. Prejudice was initially characterized as a personality deficit. After World War II, social psychologists really tried to understand this, and they often in the beginning talked about it as sort of the evil person. Somebody has an evil character. And that one of the limitations of that approach is that you're going to try to treat or cure that evil person, or you're going to try to address it at an individual level. That's really not enough. It's not effective. And developmental psychologists started formulating it as a normative process. This isn't just about an evil person. This is about prejudice emerging with group norms designed to create systemic status hierarchies, power, and privilege. And this is really what the research has been looking at in the time since, and in developmental science in the last maybe 20 or more years. Excuse me. Group norms are a really key part of this and something that we have to think about. Prejudice involves identification with groups. So we often think about when we hear this and people talk about their research, they talk about in-group bias, children have an in-group bias. And if you have an in-group bias, that means you don't like the out-group, whoever that's defined by. And there's this sort of dynamic there. That's part of it, but it's really not the whole picture. Part of it is the case that sometimes kids might have an in-group bias. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have an out-group dislike or distrust. It could be though, and often it is. This is a debate in social psychology as well. In developmental psychology, we've tried to sort of unpack this. But in developmental psychology, when we look at this kind of dynamic, we also are very mindful of the fact that group affiliation is a human need. It's an important human need. It's very important, and we've heard this from Debbie in her previous talk in so many important ways. Group affiliation provides support, protection, and safety. This is something we need to have. It's part of us. We can't live without it. But sometimes group identity and group affiliation means group loyalty, and that's sometimes where we get these problems, where it leads to prejudice. You have in-group preference, solidarity, and alliances. Sometimes that's okay, the solidarity, you need that. But sometimes this group loyalty can actually also be a serious problem for prejudice. Why? Well, if your group really wants you to be loyal, and let's say your group is doing something that's unfair, or your group says, hey, let's go and tease this other group or taunt them, or let's take all the resources for ourselves, we would identify those as sort of like unfair group norms. But if you're in that group and you want to challenge it, and you want to say this is wrong, or we shouldn't do this, or let's change how we do things, there's a high cost. What's that high cost? You're going to be excluded from that group that you really care about, that you're affiliated with. So this is a struggle for children. I'm going to talk about this when we talk about some of the basic research. So exclusion of in-group members as well as out-group members is important to look at, because if you're in a group and you don't want to challenge their unfair treatment or their stereotypes, you've got this cost that you have to think about. And so we really need to understand that. We take an approach to this called the social reasoning developmental model. I worked on this with Adam Rutland, who's at the University of Exeter, and we've worked on this for a number of years and trying to really unpack what's important and what we need to look at to understand the origins of prejudice, drawing on a number of other research traditions in our field. First, we look at when kids think about unfair treatment. When do they think it's wrong or unfair to exclude somebody? When is it, something that you shouldn't be doing? This is wrong, it's unfair. We look at this, in general, when we're looking at, say, hitting, it's wrong to hit somebody, it's wrong to take all the toys. But when is it wrong to discriminate, to use stereotypes, to exclude based on group membership? And that's really an important part of this. It's important to get to that next step of helping children and facilitating their ability to challenge what's unfair. We look at societal judgments, their group norms, their group identity. How does that factor in? When do kids think about that? And we look at their psychological knowledge, what we call attributions of others' intentions. When are kids understanding how others think about issues different from themselves? Often referred to as mental state knowledge or theory of mind. This is really an important part, and there's been some amazing research recently really trying to connect how children of theory of mind are those children who often will challenge a stereotype. They recognize that I might have this view about, girls play with dolls, but these girls, they like trucks. And you have to sort of get beyond, thinking about this. So we're looking at the interaction of these components in the child's world and their social cognitive development, but also how these manifest coming from the broader society and from their parents. There's a global basis of research on social exclusion. This research has been done in a number of countries, and these are countries that people we've collaborated with in these various places. There's also a number of different research groups coming out of this social and developmental approach to prejudice. And just to give you some examples, this is very important to understand, in terms of how we want to look at what it looks like in different places. So in the Netherlands, for example, there's some really important research on how Dutch and Muslim kids interact, what's happening, how does multiculturalism work, how are they looking at it? Or in Germany, there's research, intergroup contact, German and Turkish kids. In Australia, really important work on how Australian kids think in generally about their different ethnic groups, Aborigine, Pacific Islanders, and so forth. So there is a unique history in a lot of these situations, and we have to recognize that it's a unique history that has to be understood. History is so important. And of course, in the US, this is very, very important when we think about how groups came here. Was it voluntary or involuntary in case of slavery, or voluntary or escaping a civil war from your home country? That history is important, but also there's something that's unique, something that's generalizable here. There's the universality of this individual group dynamic that leads to group affiliation as well as group biases. So we have to that's part of the approach here, is to sort of understand, well, what's going on that's sort of similar across these different cultural contexts and what's unique. to try to understand the origins of prejudice. And I just want to mention before I talk about some of the research, the areas of convergence I see in this lecture series, and sort of part of the motivation to have this particular topic today, and that is taking these different views, origins of prejudice and ethnic and racial identity, which I've always been so drawn to the ethnic and racial identity literature. It's so fascinating, so important, but it is different. It's different from some of the research on origins of prejudice. But I think there are areas of convergence are in social justice, trying to get there, and understanding group identity. We look at group identity pretty differently in some ways, but then there's some ways in which there's overlap. So I look forward to future collaborative studies and hoping maybe some ideas percolate out of this lecture series today. So what do we know about prejudice in childhood? We know that there's different ways of looking at it. We use a lot of different measures here. We use laptops and manipulatives and surveys. There's a lot of different ways to measure it and look at it. And I'm going to talk just briefly about 3 kinds of studies. I'm going to talk about biases in peer encounters, evaluations of inclusion, exclusion, and expectations about outgroup inclusion. So what types of biases do children hold regarding interracial peer encounters? We've used this picture that we've borrowed from social information processing that uses it. It's an ambiguous picture. So you can ask, what's happening in this picture? And it's ambiguous. Carrie push Abby off the swing, or did Abby fall down and Carrie's going to help her up? And it's used to look at what's called a hostile attribution bias. Do kids just look at situations and think there's negative expectations? But we use 2 versions of this. So we have another version, and we're just interested in when do kids just use race alone to attribute different intentions in this kind of situation. And we have a versions for adolescents as well. Did Chris push Alex down, or is Bobby going to help Scott up? And there's a number of different scenarios and different kinds of situations. I'm going to just focus on the young kids today, the 7 to 10-year-olds. We interviewed about 300 kids. So if you ask them what happened, Carrie pushed Abby off the swing, what will happen next? She'll push her back. Can they be friends? No. There's negative intentions. But also what you see happening is that first intention, that first attribution that you push somebody off the swing can lead to a series of expectations that they'll escalate, they'll push her back, they can't be friends. There's all these things that can roll out of that. But if you take the other approach, Abby fell off the swing and Carrie will help her up, what will happen next? Get back on the swing, can they be friends? Yes. So this is what we have found often in the past. We found a few different findings in this current study, but it's that sort of view of negative and positive intentions. So we tested this in majority white and mixed ethnicity schools. And here's what we found. And you're looking at a graph in which the higher the bar, the more negative the rating. And you're looking at 3 groups. So these are white kids in all white schools on the left, white kids in mixed ethnicity schools in the middle, and African-American students in mixed ethnicity schools on the right. And the blue bar is the white transgressor, and the red bar is the black transgressor. So what you're seeing here is that the white kids in the white schools make a difference between their intentions between the white transgressor and the blacks. They see the white transgressor and they think, oh, they're going to help them up. But they see the black transgressor and think they pushed them down. So there's a significant difference there. But white kids in mixed ethnicity schools did not make a difference, and neither did African-American students in the mixed ethnicity schools. And what you see also here is that the white kids in the white schools kind of have an in-group bias that's positive. There is an out-group negative bias because of the contrast there. But when you look across the different samples, you see that really what's going on here also is the in-group bias. We did this study also for Anderson Cooper for a story on kids on race, and we interviewed 145 kids, 6-year-olds and 13-year-olds in Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia. It was a fascinating study. When we were able to, the team there at CNN interviewed the parents, watching the kids give all these responses. And when the kids were talking, they were talking about, when they're asking like, can they be friends? Some of the kids were saying, well, no, because my parents don't want me to play with somebody different skin color. And they had the parents watching them, which of course we can't do with IRB, because we always tell the kids that, when we interview them, it's anonymous and confidential, but they were able to do that, through their legal team and how they handled it. But what was really interesting was a lot of the parents said, wow, it's a wake-up call. They just didn't expect it. They were really surprised to hear their kids talk about this, that you can't play with somebody different skin color. And it was also stated by kids who were both white and Black, wasn't just the white kids in this case. The parents talked about it too, and really had a lot of really interesting insights. I wish I could have analyzed those data, but it was really interesting to hear them. So what have we learned? Biases exist in the context of interracial peer encounters, and particularly the white kids in the white schools. Children in the mixed ethnicity schools think cross-race friendships more likely. So that was another finding, that they really were much more likely to think cross-race friendships are likely and positive and will happen, even when they were slightly more, had more negative expectations about the initial act. So now I'm going to talk about what happens when we ask kids to evaluate social inclusion in same race and interracial peer encounters. I just talked about when you're just showing kids an ambiguous picture and you ask them what happened here. But now I'm going to give a little more, we're giving more detail to the kids to try to pick out something that happens in their everyday situation that we've heard about many times. And that is riding the bus and who you're going to sit next to on their bus. So we showed kids these pictures and we told them a story, a short vignette. Karen and Jane, they're really good friends. They sit next to each other in the bus every day. And then Diane's a new girl, and we have a boy version. New girl comes in the bus. And Karen says, oh, let's invite her to sit next to us. And Jane says, I don't want to, I wanted to sit with us. And so you see there's two versions. There's same race white and same race Black, which we give to the kids to match to race. But we also give, and we ask them, how likely is it that Karen will ask Diane to sit with them? So that's the question we're asking. But we also have scenarios in which there are mixed ethnicity. So you can see there's two versions of when kids are going to decide to invite whether somebody's a different race and who they're asking. So this is about 246 kids with 9 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 14-year-olds, and evenly divided by race. In this case, we are focusing on African-American, European-American kids. So what did we find? Well, first of all, when we asked them this question, the 9 to 11-year-olds did not make any distinction between these situations. They thought that they would all be inclusive. Like on a scale of sort of a score of 4 out of a scale of 1 to 6. So they were pretty much thinking that they're probably going to include this new girl or this new boy. But the adolescence was a little bit different. So with the adolescents, you're looking at a graph now where the higher the bar, the more likely it is to include. And there's two groups here, the white European American kids, the African American kids, and then the 3 conditions. And so the blue is the same race, the red is interracial, with white kids deciding it, and the green is interracial, with Black kids deciding it. And so what you see on the left side is that the European American kids, they're more likely to think that they're going to, they will think that it's more likely for them to include when it's same race than when it's different race. And it didn't really matter which group it was, whether it's 2 white kids thinking about it or 2 Black kids thinking about it. Surprisingly, we thought that would make a difference. But you can see that those adolescent kids are also thinking that they're going to include more likely in the same race condition, but the African American kids don't make any distinction there. They're probably going to include on most of them. And this was done with Shelby Cooley and Amanda Burkholder. So what have we learned so far? White adolescents think it's more likely to include another same race than a different race peer. And particularly when a same race friend discourages it. So the same race friend is saying, I don't think we should sit next to them or have them sit next to us. So we're bringing in something here that's tapping into group norms and expectations from friendships about whether it's okay or not okay to do it. The African-American students didn't make this distinction though. So what is it that leads to these types of preferences? You know, in a number of studies, we found that when we've asked kids about these questions, we often get this kind of comment of, well, they won't have much in common. In fact, Martin Ruck and I, in a series of studies way back, we asked kids just outright, we were asking about inclusion, exclusion, and we said, well, what is it about race that makes people uncomfortable? And a lot of the kids would talk about, you just don't have much in common, you're just different. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean your interest? Does it mean your actual race or ethnicity? What does it mean? We wanted to sort of unpack that. So we did what we call the sort of we don't have much in common study. And this is with Aline Hitti. And we decided to have Arab students as sort of the target group here for this study. And so we told kids about two groups. This is your American group of friends, and the participants are all non-Arab American kids. Here's your American friends, and you like music and photography and rollerblading. And here's your other group of friends, Arab American group of friends, and they like photography, tennis, and painting. So it's a different interest, different group. And we pitted them, we asked them, who would they be more likely to include? Would they be more likely to include somebody who is a different ethnicity but has the same interests, or somebody who is the same ethnicity with different interests? So you can see here, we asked both groups that. So the American group, if they pick the Layla, she's different ethnicity but has the same interests. If they pick Hannah, she's the same ethnicity, but in this case, the same nationality, but different interests. We asked both groups this. So here's what we found. We found that when we're asking them, you're looking at a graph where the higher the bar, the more likely it is that they would include this person. And there's the two groups that they're thinking about and looking at. There's the American group and the Arab group. And so when the kids who are not Arab looking at the American group, they think, oh, it's likely they'll include Layla. They'll include the girl or the boy version. They'll include somebody who's different from them but has the same interests. But when you ask them about what would the American group, the Arab group do, they say, oh, well, the Arab group, they would pick somebody who's Arab, even if they don't have the same interests. Now, so this is a problem because they're thinking they're inclusive, that's fine, except that if they think the other group is going to be exclusive, it can be a serious problem. It sort of means that you wouldn't invite them to the party because they'll only want to be with their own kind. And that's kind of what they said. When we looked at their reasoning, they talked a lot about, well, the American adolescents talked about, well, an Arab group, they just want to be with their own kind. They prefer their own kind. They want to hang out there. And this is also a serious problem when you're thinking about the fact that in this school district that we are in this particular school, 10% of the students identify as Arab. So you have 10% of the students, you've got the majority of these students in the school thinking that they only want to hang out with their own kind. So, you're doing, there's a couple of problems. I mean, obviously one, they're going to be potentially excluded from a lot of opportunities, but also you're assuming homogeneity. They just are the same. They have the same interests, and assumptions of homogeneity of a group are really a place where stereotypes get formed and are reflected by that kind of judgment. And in fact, we got 53% of the sample reported stereotypic associations about Arab kids. So this kind of judgment is something we really have to look at closely. So I just want to talk a little bit about school composition and group contact, and then talk about the intervention study. Cross-group contact, friendships reduces bias. There's been a lot of research on this, not just from us, but many people. Linda Tropp and Tom Pettigrew have really done a lot of this work, and Mariana Turner and Lindsay Cameron and many others. And this has been shown, now it has been shown a lot of times there's benefits for the racial ethnic majority group for friendship potential. And this is a problem to some extent, of course, because you're thinking, well, it's good if the majority group becomes friends and understands this, but what about the minority group? However, there has been research shown that this has also been effective for minority groups, because not all minority groups are the same either. So Martin Ruck has done some work on this in Brooklyn with Latino and Black kids, and showing that when they actually have contact, that their inter-ethnic contact, those kids who have high inter-ethnic friendships are more likely to think that the exclusion is wrong, and less likely to have bias. And Philippe Jugert looked at this in Germany with Turkish and German kids and found that the Turkish kids benefited by this intergroup contact. So there needs to be more research on that. There's not enough research on the minority perspective on this, so we really need to see much more there. But also, what is it about friendships, cross-group friendships, that are so important? It's important because it helps children to challenge stereotypes. If you have a friend of a different ethnicity and then you hear a stereotype about them, or you watch something, you hear something about them, you can say, my friend's not like that. It's your own experience that helps you to challenge that stereotype, to reject unfair treatment. That experience is important. We can teach children these things and we can talk to them about it, but having their own experience is powerful. And also, ethnic and racially diverse school compositions have many benefits for all students, but also very much for minority students. And Yana Jovanovan and Sandra Graham have done amazing work on this at UCLA in terms of looking at how safety, support, and academic motivation is increased for these students when there isn't a majority group in the school system. And so that's something that we are also sort of trying to look at. Okay, so there's a window of opportunity here. Stereotypes, biases, and exclusionary attitudes are difficult to change by adulthood, and understanding prejudice from early childhood to adulthood is crucial. So the time for intervention is childhood. So we created a program called Developing Inclusive Youth. It's a web-based curriculum tool with teacher-led classroom discussions. And we are doing a randomized controlled trial to test the effectiveness of this program. We're using younger kids, 8 to 11-year-olds at 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And right now we've just finished a study in 48 classrooms. We're doing 2 studies. The first study funded by NSF, which is completed, I'm going to tell you about very briefly, is 982 participants, and these are in majority white schools, 60% majority and 40% ethnic minority. So there's almost an even balance, but slight majority for the white students. And the ethnic minority students were from 4 different groups. We have a second study in progress, which is our 2044 study, where we're going to look at schools that have no majority groups. So we're going to look at a number of schools and see how this program works when there isn't a majority ethnic or racial group. So I'm just going to give you a quick idea of what this program is about. Kids see a portal, and there's one each week, and there's a different target group in each week in terms of exclusion. And so a girl could be excluded from a science club, or an African-American girl excluded from a ballet group, or Latino boy from playing at the park. We have wealth status, immigrant status, and different ethnic groups, and an immigrant status one. And so they see these once a week, and they go into this portal, and I'll show you what happens when they go into it. I'm going to use Park as an example. So they see sort of pictures, there's voiceover, they have Chrome notebooks, headphones on, they're doing this for 15 minutes in the classroom, and they hear a story, a vignette, some boys playing at the park, and they look over and see Carlos is there waiting for his turn. And this one boy says, yeah, well, but you're not one of us. We're the ones who use the tire swing. Why don't you go over and play with what's his name, Juan over there? He's from Mexico too. And Carlos says, but I was waiting for the swing this whole time because besides, I don't even know Juan. I'm not from Mexico. I was born here. I go to the same school as you. Well, since we're still on it, we get to decide who uses it next, and we're going to give it to them, meaning the other two. And so there's a lot of other slides I'm skipping over, but there's a sort of discussion about this. And so then the kids are asked, how good or bad does each person feel? And it's highlighted for each person. And the kids are putting in how they'll each feel. They're asked if it's okay or not okay for this to happen. And then they're also given an option to see what happens. They say, should you include or exclude him, or let him on the swing or not? And so in this case, if a child picks it, it's okay to give it to them. Then you ask for reasons, and you gain the reasoning for why this should be done. And there's reasons generated from our research. And then you see what happens if he's excluded, and there's sort of a sequence of events from that. But if you see what happens when they include him, then you see, I'm skipping over obviously a lot of different slides, but you see that they end up together on the swing, and they get a wrap-up story about, what makes this important, about standing up to your friends can be hard, but why that's important to do. So it's voiceover animated exclusion scenarios. The teacher leads the discussion following the tool for 30 minutes. And this is really the crux of it. The scenarios that they see are important, but it's the conversations that's the real heart of, I think, what can predict and help for change. They sit in a circle in front of the classroom. We do a teacher training workshop, guided charts for discussion, weekly feedback. This is just a quick example of one of the charts we give to teachers. We have teachers every week. We'll have one for each scenario. They talk about a safe space, making connections, reflecting. We want teachers to talk about the main points, get both sides, wrap up. There's points about discrimination, bystanders. So in other words, what we're doing is helping teachers to facilitate this conversation. We don't want teachers to teach it literally, which is what teachers want to do. We want teachers to facilitate it. We want them to bring out these things. We want them to get the kids talking to each other. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the conversations that kids say, and we have 500 entries in a data file, the kinds of things kids have said over these many different scenarios, and this is just a few examples of them. We do get anti-stereotypes. People are not good or bad because of their skin color. We get broader societal issues. Arabs are viewed as bad because the news always shows them in war. We get empathy statements, promoting inclusive behavior. And we get exclusive statements. Kids are saying things, they're perpetuating stereotypes. The stereotypes that Asians are smart and that's good for Asians. they're denying the broader societal issues. They are stating things that don't seem to show much empathy. You know, just get over it. You have to deal with it if you're excluded. They're justifying exclusive behavior. And then the last area that we look at, which is really important, is their personal experiences. So they talk about, they told me I couldn't play with them because I'm a girl and girls can't play soccer, or I have a friend who's Black and even though he looks different from me, we're still best friends. My friend said I was too fat to play soccer. A group of guys assumed I didn't like Star Wars and made me feel left out. Well, these are powerful statements that they're making, and there's a conversation about it, and kids are talking to each other and they're telling them, you know, wait, you should let her play, or you should let them play, or why did that happen? And there's just a lot of discussion among the kids. These are very animated conversations. You know, when people talk about kids aren't ready to talk about these things, that's not true. They really want to, and there's a forum for doing it. So it's a randomized controlled trial. We pre-test and post-test kids at week 1 and week 10, and then there's the control group and the intervention. And we have different outcome variables about inclusion, exclusion judgments, and trait assignments, and math and science competency beliefs, which just means you know, are kids good or bad at math and science? You ask them and show pictures of kids and reported play contact with peers. All right, so we ran regression coefficients for differences between the DIY program group and the control group on outcome variables overall. And again, I'm just going to highlight one or a couple of findings here to be illustrative. But when you look at it, we found that there was a significant difference. So kids in the program were more likely to think that interracial peer inclusion was wrong and exclusion was wrong than did kids in the control group. We also found that this trait association based on gender and ethnicity was reduced and changed. So when we asked them about who's hardworking or lazy or mean or friendly those kinds of traits, there are fewer of them by kids who are in the program than in the control group. We also got significant difference in terms of math and science competency and beliefs, who's good at math and science in terms of gender and race. And we got almost significant, it wasn't, so we have to keep working on this, but reported contact, that's play with diverse peers. And we can talk about that later about what we think, what's going on there. So the intervention was successful in changing children's intergroup attitudes and reducing prejudice. And some new directions we have are looking at these minority majority schools, looking much more closely at teacher beliefs, analyses of classroom discussions, and the broader impact. The broader implications here, facilitating cross-group friendships is essential for the global diverse world of childhood and adulthood. And we want to reduce bias that involves promoting concepts of fairness and equality in everyday interactions. Reducing prejudice in childhood creates healthy children and a more just and civil society. Thank you. I want to thank the doctoral students who worked so hard on all this research and all these projects. At this project, the lab managers, our advisory board, and collaborators on this project. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. So switching, I just have a couple of remarks and then we're going to go into Q&A. So it has been such a joy to listen today. If we were at a conference in person, we would have totally needed an overflow room. So I want to begin by acknowledging how difficult this current time is. That the pandemic, as the pandemic rages, that it's a difficult time for many of us. In June, I virtually taught a cohort of Black girls in middle school. I called it Black Girl Power Hour. And then again, since August, I have donned my PPE each week to teach in a socially distant classroom. While I'm often the person who prepares the PowerPoints and considers what the weekly takeaways will be, what I've learned from students is far greater than any of the lessons or the content that I have created this semester. So I want to begin my brief discussant remarks by reading a poem that was collectively created by 22 Black girls during the Black Girl Power Hour class that I taught. It was titled Power to the People During the Pandemic. This was modeled after Power to the People, written by Jacqueline Woodson, that it can be read in Brown Girl Dreaming. So together, the girls on Zoom each came up with different sentences. So this is a compilation of their sentences. On the television screen, we hear 8 minutes and 46 seconds of breathing. We hear chants from people of all races that Black Lives Matter. We hear reminders to vote in the next election. We see Black Lives Matter murals being created, then erased, created, then erased. We Black girls feel real suspicious, awkward, frustrated, sad, but sometimes inspired. Because people are rising, people are connecting and marching and starting businesses. We're buying Black and speaking truth, signing petitions and unfollowing. Because Black lives do matter. Our skin tone is not a threat. We are not criminals. We want you to unlearn your racism, see us, respect us, know that us Black girls, we matter. I bring that into the space because I think it is so powerful and it speaks to the students' experiences, what they are experiencing during this time. Dr. Killen so expertly walked us through what prejudice is, what we know about it as a field, and what types of interventions work. In her work, she asked children questions like, what's happening in this picture? Can they be friends? Thinking about the girls that I taught this summer, they said things like, we see Black Lives Matter murals being erased, then created, erased. My question to them would be, what's happening in that picture? What will happen next? Can they be friends? And I think my students and the research participants, Black students that I work with, even further, they ask a question is, can we be friends? Will I be seen as a threat? In her curriculum tool, Dr. Killen challenges youth to have conversations about unfair treatment and taking action. My question is, what conversations are happening right now in classrooms and around dinner tables? What beliefs or emotions, behaviors, and practices are being created, then erased or created? The girls talk about, but people are rising. My girls, they argue that youth cope and thrive all the time, and I agree. Both Dr. Rivas-Drake and my students talk about the importance of youth being proud, resisting, and speaking truth to power. So my question for all of us who are in the room today, what constructive action are we prompted to during this moment to support children? In reminding us about what it's like to come of age in a changing United States, Dr. Rivas-Drake presents a roadmap that bears repeating again and again. 1, name the problem. My girls said, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of breathing. 2, identify community assets. My girl said, because people are rising, people are connecting, they're marching and starting businesses. 3, learn from youth. My girl said, we want you to unlearn your racism, see us, respect us, know that Black girls matter. 4, learn from families. My research overall seeks to understand the constellation of protection and resilience underscoring Black children's learning and positive development across multiple contexts, with a heavy focus on Black students' experiences within formal and informal educational settings. What we know, as Dr. Vanessa Siddle-Walker described in this year's AERA presidential presentation, is that African-American families in particular have always cultivated cultural resilience during unsettling times. By looking at the context, she says, by looking at the context that they have and determining what they need to figure out and solve the problems that are before them. So those messages of cultural pride, they matter. What I've also found through my own work with Black girls is that Black girls make meaning of their ethnic racial identity mainly in response to stereotypical and biased messages within their multiple worlds. So schools, classrooms, families, and peers. One Black girl even said that her peers, she was a biracial Black girl, said, my peers, they told me what I was before I could tell them what I was. So therefore, it's so important to explore this construction of other, whether that be through the messages of pride at the dinner table or messages of xenophobia on the news or in the curriculum. 5, learn from educators. As Dr. Bettina Love so astutely said at a conference this weekend, Gloria Ladson-Billings gave us the playbook. When are we going to use the playbook that she gave us? In a recent paper I wrote alongside Dr. Joanna Lee Williams, Haley Johnson, Kimberly Dickerson, Andrea Negrete, and Murray Seward, we looked at adolescents' perceptions of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. We found great heterogeneity in how youth interpreted and responded to the rally. What we also found is that they're tasked with making meaning of important big concepts like racism and white supremacy, while also trying to define and describe their own identities. Again, context mattered so much here, and most of us students noticed the silence of the educators during that time. So I ask, what could have been created? What could have been erased? What opportunity to rise did we miss? And then 6, most importantly, advance justice. I have a tweet from Bernice King, the daughter of Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King Jr. printed in my office. She says, divest your energy from imagining the worst and invest your energy in committing to and working for better, to strategizing and organizing for justice. So as we move into the question and answer portion of today's lecture, some of you have sent questions, thank you. Please continue to send them. I want to end with that and acknowledge that there is powerful transformation that could be happening during this time. And so as all of us are gathering virtually, may we never overlook the power of connecting with other scholars in this way, particularly interdisciplinary scholars who we may not be regularly in conversation with, as well as listening to young people, that many of the answers that we have can be readily answered by the children that we are studying when we work in concert with them. The brilliant Black woman poet who I love, June Jordan, she says, we're the ones we've been waiting for. So I hope that for those of you who are listening and the opportunity that I have to kind of speak to this virtual room, that all of our work will reflect that, because I think that at the end of the day, we have a wonderful opportunity to think about these concepts in critical ways. So as you continue to send in your questions, view in the Q&A, I have a few questions that I would like to ask, and then I will move to some of the questions that have been sent in. So just to start, in revisiting this concept, the topic of constructing the other, I'd like to hear from both of you kind of what is your understanding of othering and what contributes to the disruption of othering that leads to discrimination, social exclusion, and inequalities. So if anyone would like to begin.
I'll start. Okay, so you're asking us sort of how do we think about constructing the other, or how do we think kids and adolescents think about it?
How do you think about kind of the concept of constructing the other?
I think it's an excellent question and a really good question for research on origins of prejudice, because I think we've often identified other as sort of somebody who's perceived as the outgroup by an individual. And what is that outgroup? That outgroup could mean many different things, right? But we've looked at it in the research in terms of the canonical categories that have been targets for discrimination and prejudice and bias. So we're looking, the most common kinds of categories are often gender, race, ethnicity, and as I mentioned, this research, of course, has been done around the world. So nationality, immigrant status, wealth status, and so forth, religion. But we really want to contextualize it in terms of not we do that because we know there's so much evidence showing that kids do view somebody on these categories as different, but ultimately, we want to know who they are thinking about is different. And of course, what a lot of us have talked about more recently is, and in the literature, is intersectionality. So a lot of times in the research, we're identifying an outgroup as one group, but we're all members of more than one group, and we're often members of more than one stigmatized group in many cases. So research is moving already in that direction too. It makes it more complicated. But just as an example, race and wealth, are highly confounded, and what does that look like, and how do kids think about it? I keep resorting back to how kids think about it, because that's so much of what our perspective is about. But so I guess the other is that person who you think of as different from yourself on a set of criteria, And then the way that we look at that, we need to, I think, move beyond some of these, focus on some of these groups and think about, because in one study we had where we were focusing on sort of gender and race, we actually talked to kids about who is often excluded and included and how do they feel about that. And for them in elementary school is age. Age was their big factor, because older kids do this and we don't get to, and younger kids. And so, we don't, that's a different kind of out group, but I mean, there's a lot of different ways this can be conceptualized.
Thank you, Melanie. I want to first say thank you, Lauren. I'm like so inspired. That was so beautiful and creative and poetic. I mean, we brought poetry into the space. I just love that, and I really appreciated that approach to your discussion. So with the question, I have like so many thoughts about this question because I think about it in so many levels, like and layers. I think about othering. So one thing like no one has really said during this whole event is really talked about like white supremacy or really thought about like cultural racism. And I think that the other, and I focus really on race and ethnicity. And so I do that because of the primacy of race and ethnicity in the US. And so, and I recognize that that's not the case everywhere. So, and with that, I guess other to me always is in relation to what's dominant, and in the US, right, like white supremacist norms like are dominant, right? Like whiteness is dominant. And so other is always like in relation to that, and in terms of whether you're asked as a minoritized or marginalized group member, like to align or accommodate that, right? To assimilate to or not. And so there's like all those layers there for me in terms of thinking about the other. And lately we've been talking about like decentering whiteness. And so I think about other as someone recently said, it's not replacing the center with another group, dominant group or one particular group, but rather bringing more groups into the center. And I really like that kind of idea. And so thinking about other as the idea that there can only be one dominant perspective, and what would it look like to have multiple dominant perspectives, if that makes sense, The other thing that I think about is there's this like really beautiful concept called epistemic bias that has like rocked my world in terms of, I mean, I bring it into some work that I do around faculty hiring, and because of my excellent colleague, Isis Settles, in that context, I'm able to kind of engage with her and learn from her about this concept. And it's this idea of like, what is considered to be central or dominant in a particular field. And I think that it's interesting to think about this event as like an intergroup context where we're kind of bringing together two perspectives and thinking about, is there one that is more dominant or not? I think there are multiple. There are actually many other perspectives that are not represented in just the two of us. But that we would want to be thinking about that, like the othering that happens in terms of whose voices and whose scholarship is considered to be dominant or mainstream or more acceptable and more accepted. So I always think about it at that level as well. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there because I really could go. That's a great question. I don't know. My work, I think, in terms of the second part of that question, has really been about bringing the voices of the non-dominant or the marginalized voices more to the center of the study of child development. And I had this like epiphany a long time ago that there's so many people that learn about this work directly or indirectly through, like in college courses and there's a lot of ways that our work could go even more, have more of a reach in terms of people who work with youth and serve youth. And there's such a hunger for this. But even just the idea of defining, and also that in the field, we stand on the shoulders of many people for decades, really have been pushing for, really centering the experiences of, racially marginalized youth as just, and even reintroducing concepts that now feel a little bit more mainstream, like the idea of identity being a little bit more in the mainstream is sort of like an evolution that has happened for a long time. So I think about it that way as well, that I think I've contributed to that.
Thank you. So there's so many great questions. Many of the questions look at kind of adopting an intersectional perspective and looking at kind of multiple different, they talked about different identities here. So one question, and I'll read just kind of two as an illustrative example. How do you think these findings relate to the experiences and development of LGBTQ+ children who do not typically have families also in or accepting of this social group, as is common with racial ethnic groups? Should future research on interventions that expand connection with this community be a protective factor? And some other questions related to thinking about what about students who are biracial and as well as students with disability. And so thinking about how do the different kind of identities influence some of the work, or how could you think about that?
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that it's sort of like what we were talking, when I was talking about sort of the international context of social exclusion, that similarly, we need to do this carefully, very carefully when we're sort of going from one group to another, because there are some things that will generalize in terms of just like what we're talking about individual group dynamics, but some things are unique. So, if you're looking at LGBTQ or race or ethnicity, you have to you want to first understand each phenomenon in its own right, So for example, like the LGBTQ identity, there's new research on that or emerging research on that. It's been on for a little while, but not to the same extent as you say with gender and race. So it seems like on the one hand, you want to really understand that what kids are going through on its own, and then sort of figure out how that also intersects with race and ethnicity. I don't know if that was all one question. Maybe you're just asking different questions from different places, but I think that just a general point about that, so that, some people, I think it's important that we have experts in developmental science, who really do know some of these group identities and study them. I mean, Deborah knows Latinx, community and that identity, and in a very deep way, and in terms of the research. And I think each of us has those kind of areas that we look at and that we know well. And so I think it's just important to think about that and then to move to the other. And I just want to mention one thing about the biracial identity and multiracial, which is really important because that is becoming a very big category. It used to be people would say, well, if they're looking at race, they have the white kids or black kids, Latino and Asian, but the other kids they just can't use in the analyses because they're the extra or the other. And now there's many more. I mean, the second largest ethnic minority group in our sample in a very large school district is multiracial. So it's a very large sample, which is really important. And it's very, very important you think about it in terms of something like even intergroup contacts. We're talking about cross-race friendships. So this is like in your family, in terms of what that means. So there's a lot of interesting ways to pursue all that research.
And I think I would say that there's some things that translate and some that don't. So one of the things is the idea that we all belong to multiple categories, or we claim multiple categories. We all have different like experiences or exposure to oppression and privilege, like along different axes. And I guess the part that would, kind of transfer is that we make meaning of those categories and those experiences, and that, there's some, in at least from my perspective, we can compensate so that if at home you're not supported in your in a adaptive or healthy, kind of meaning making experience, that especially as youth get older, they're able to find niches and like create contexts or find and supportive context where they can really develop their sense of identity with that marginalized identity, even if it's not supported at home. And I think that that's something that's true, whether you're talking about, biracial context and being biracial, has its own, right, like there's own theorizing around that, but then also just the idea that if at home you're, not supported, or you're hearing, internalized racism could be happening at home for sure, or just like negative messages. And that's true even in a monoracial situation, that, there's not just one context that kids are picking up and kind of drawing on, as we saw in some of the quotes from our parents, like, they're kind of making sense of it all together over time. And that if kids are given opportunities to explore and really think about those categories, I mean, that's ultimately what I would encourage or support. I mean, I don't know that there's like a solution to that, like if you're not getting it at home. And I would say that as kids get older, they're going to find ways to sort of have experiences that help them to make sense of who they are, along those marginalized categories.
Are you talking about multiracial groups particularly when you say that, or like?
No, I was thinking about the LGBTQ, like, so I think the question, if I heard it correctly, was like, if you're not supported, so there might be like homophobia, right, transphobia, if you're trans, at home, so you're not getting like the socialization about, oh, you need to feel like a sense of pride in who you are, and that self-worth messages, as some of my colleagues would call it. So I think that, so I was just responding to that. If that's not happening at home, I think that as kids get older, certainly in adolescence, they will go try to identify places where that's the case, where they can kind of learn more in a positive way what that identity can mean.
Yeah, I mean,
it's important to have a sense of connection, and it's just like a basic need that you will want to have fulfilled.
To talk about, we're talking about LGBTQ, like for example, transgender, like that's like also what I was talking about earlier, like we need expertise, like Christina Olsen, has been doing this amazing longitudinal study across the US on transgender kids and how they're growing up and the messages they're getting and what it's looked like and identification, all that. And I think that's really important model for a lot of this too, because we want to, before we sort of like just combine different groups. I mean, this research is really hard to do, but we have to do it because we think it's the right thing to do. But you want to understand a phenomenon in depth. And so that, I think that's a really important study. And I feel that way about also the multiracial, biracial, individuals in terms of like as a group membership, in terms of at least the kind of research I do, like we really want to understand that, what is that like? There really needs to be a really focused study on exactly that whole experience. So we're not like just making our own assumptions about it. And so again, each group needs to have focused research on that, on the experiences, but then you want to also look at what is going to be in common across groups that experience discrimination, that experience exclusion, that experience unfair treatment, because everybody does on some category or another. And of course, some groups much, much more than other groups and so forth. But so there's got to be a process here to do this really carefully.
Yeah, I would agree with that we want like within group, expertise on within group variation for sure. And I mean, I think that that reflects my approach as well. And then there are aspects across that might, kind of make sense to look at and think about across groups, but that the unique context is really important. I mean, I think so all of it is necessary, and there aren't as many opportunities like this for people just who even focus on one social identity, right? Like to get together. And there are folks who are actually looking at multiple social identities together in ways that are really interesting to me, like Russ Toomey and Carlos Santos have done that, really thinking about gender and not just like gender as a category, but really like the meaning making around gender. Ani Rogers is another name that comes to mind. So there are folks out there that are doing that, and I think it's important direction for the field.
On that note, there's a great question here about that says, considering that utilization of discrete categories within research can have adverse effects, oversimplification of experience, generalization of phenomena, what's the best way to collect demographic information with psychological research that and/or kind of better capture intersectional identities?
Yeah, I don't know if we're supposed to keep going the same order, Deborah. So however you want to do this.
I could go first if you want to change up.
change up, you go.
I would say that, oh, this is such a good question, because truly, if you look at, there are trade-offs in all areas, and everyone who is in every different type of category, I guess is what I mean to say. And I think that, if we say, I don't want us to move to a model where we're not assessing anything because we can't do everything, like all the things, so if you're thinking about something like race or racial identity or ethnic identity, truly the ideal would be to capture all of the different experiences and aspects of that category, like not just like your own sense of connection to the group and how much you thought about it and what it means, but then also things like, marginalization that you're exposed to, like discrimination based on that category. And yet, of course, not every researcher will be, so that would be my recommendation, is like, get the full picture of that experience of that category. And the same could be said for gender and any other social identity, but I think, or category. I think that that's not realistically what people are going to do. They're going to make choices. And I think, so I would say anything that's more than a basic, just a category. And at the very minimum, if you have no space for nothing else, try to get self-identified labels and categories that kids, right? Like the categories that they name for themselves. It's not easy to analyze the data when you use those categories as either. So has its own, there's another process about, related to that in terms of how to use that in relation to things like forced choice. But at the bare minimum, if you do nothing else, if you can't really get at identity and you're wanting to get at something that's more than just a, binary or like, a box that really doesn't reflect, like a full experience, try to get at what kids say in a more open-ended way. Although that will present new challenges also.
Yeah, I mean, I think just conceptually, it's really important that we've moved beyond just studying white people. So, which is the case a couple of decades ago, or just boys. So, and I think what's really important is just trying to be really careful about your demographic sample. So, trying to get self-identification. With younger children, we usually have two sources. We ask parents how they would identify the ethnicity, and then we ask children how they would, and you look at that. But I think that the important thing is so we've got to start somewhere. We have to do this, and so you have identification of groups, and then you're gonna. I think it's look at it. I think it's really important, though, to be really careful about, at least in our case, for the kind of research we do. I mean, in the area, is your stimuli matching to your participants. So if you're going to have a broad sample and interview, for the kind of stuff we do, interview a lot of kids of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, which is typically what we do, then you really want to look at your stimuli and think about, if you're presenting pictures of kids, what pictures are you presenting, and does it reflect your sample? And, just be really conscientious and careful about that. In terms of how we do that. But I think also, I mean, it's a good question in terms of often people perceive, I think we all perceive an oversimplification of their groups, because any group is more complicated, but you want to start somewhere. And so like, if you're going to have, I mean, the Latinx, is it Cuban or Puerto Rican or Dominican, right? And that's true for any group. And I actually also think it's really important for us to at some point get to, look at this in terms of white identity, because white is a very heterogeneous group. Now, when you're looking at power and privilege and status, I absolutely understand why the category is white, but white itself can be people from many different backgrounds and different religions and so forth. And so especially if the country's moving towards no majority group, I hope that we also can get to a point where we can break down that category too, and try to get at what's represented. For some kids, we ask them sometimes and they say, I'm Italian, or I'm Irish, or I'm Jewish, or I'm all these different groups that have their own histories as well. So I fully understand, and I do this too, but I think that's an oversimplification. And sometimes I hope we don't always have to use skin color as identification. And I realize why that's also complicated. Like Debbie said, all these labels are complicated, and there's no easy answer, but you want to at least pursue this research and figure out ways to do it. So it does capture some of the complexity.
So we are moving closer to the end of our time. There are a couple questions, Dr. Killen, about the materials that you presented. So one person asked, would there be a difference with real people as opposed to animated people?
Difference between what?
Real people. So I imagine they're talking about videos rather than images or animations.
Right, right. Oh, and maybe in the intervention study.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We've gone back and forth about this many, many times. Could we have Confederate children and could we have videos and all that? And it's very difficult because, we're trying to set up a certain kind of dialogue. And our dialogue and conversations all come from our research, from what we've heard kids say over many, many years. So I think there's an authenticity to all the dialogue and conversations. But yes, animated versus video. I mean, these are 8 to 11-year-old children for this study. So I think in this study, I think that probably is fine. Of course, if we wanted to scale this up for adolescents, maybe we would have to do it differently. But you can use photos, still photos, but if you have animation, if you have video, then you've got to really have these trained character actors, and it gets kind of complicated. We found that it's important to have realistic renderings, though, not to be cartoonish. We have a professional illustrator, and Joan Tico, and she, makes sure we try to render it so it's as realistic looking as possible. Kids are used to this. For adults, it might seem more, might seem unfamiliar, but kids are very, very used to it. A lot of their curriculum materials and all that they read and books and everything is sort of animated in that sense.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna try and squeeze in 2 more questions. Another one for you, Dr. Killen, was many intervention programs that are designed to reduce prejudice and promote positive interracial attitudes seem to be limited to have short-term effects. Do you expect the last intervention program that you discussed will have substantial impacts over time? And what do you think could happen for those programs lacking sustainability?
Oh, I think ours is going to be a lifetime of constant, yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. I think that, and also in the first study, we have 1 follow-up, but we've got to have more follow-ups, but 2 months, 3 months. I do think there's going to be sustained effect, but I think it's partly because of the conversations that kids are having, real conversations in the classroom with teachers and, leading the discussion. And the teachers are supposed to not say much. They're supposed to just let the kids talk, because that's real. You remember conversations and things that kids said to you in elementary school. I mean, everybody can remember things about elementary school. They never chose me to be the crossing guard. I mean, we have all kinds of, examples of that, but these conversations are pretty different from what they usually have. And they're things that just completely brushed over at recess. Kid says, you can't play with us, you're a girl. And then it's dropped and it's never come back. And now they have this safe space in a classroom. We're hoping to change group norms. So it's not just like the minute-to-minute experience, but if a girl says that and the boy says, well, I didn't know you wanted to play soccer, and then he says, I'll let you next time, he has now verbally said it out loud in the classroom context. And so, hoping to change the group norms, I think, is what will have a lasting effect, a lasting impact. So yes, we do hope that it will. Why other programs don't? There aren't that many programs on prejudice. I mean, I've done a pretty thorough review. There's a fair number on cross-group contact, which is real. Those are really important. But prejudice per se, are focused on that. A lot on bullying. The bullying literature is really big, and there's a lot on bullying, but that doesn't tend to be in the context of intergroup issues of prejudice. So thanks for the question, and we're hoping it does, and there's many different ways to think about it.
Thank you. And Dr. Rivas-Drake, this question is a big question. And so just kind of very briefly, I apologize, I'm giving this to you as the last one. But given that...
I'm not sure what I'm preparing for here, but...
Given that historically research has been done with predominantly white samples, do you have suggestions on how to disentangle what has been considered universal developmental processes, but likely not? It seems our basic models of how children develop from infancy came from the days when mostly white samples were used, and we need to move beyond that and be more careful about our basic assumptions about development.
That's a really good question. I think that there's some things, okay, so in every domain of development, I think there have been people who have been agitating to, or have been trying to really think through, like, is this sort of framework that was developed, right, like with a white sample, white middle class, we hear that a lot, actually makes sense? Do we need to try to think about how it should be modified, or should we start from the ground up and develop like a more I don't want to say group specific, like endogenous to the group, right? Like, so that come out of the group's experiences. And I feel that it's hard to, there's a tension in our, I think we've heard it today too, like between wanting to represent the unique experiences of particular groups, and even within these larger categories, like the very unique experiences and even more localized experiences of particular families and their realities, with maybe the need, the broader push for making claims about what is universal in development. And in identity, we see this in terms of the different concepts and constructs. I often get the question about, like, can you look at that construct in a white sample? Because the concepts and the constructs in the identity literature really come out of literature and theorists and theorizing and, the research of scholars, who were trying to represent experiences that were not in the literature, right, at the time that they were developing them. So can you just, apply it to another group? And then I think in that literature, we've gone back and forth. I'm not even addressing the issues about, just like the category of white, but just, can you think about white racial identity using a similar even measure, or like the concept, does it make sense to look at it in the same way that you would for, Puerto Rican identity, let's say. And I think where we're netting out in that field, and I think, so this is kind of an example of like, you sort of go back and forth, and that's how the science works itself out, right? Like you go back and forth about which things make sense and which don't, which apply, which don't. We can do things like measurement equivalence testing or invariance testing. We could look at, actually just conceptually, like, does this make sense to assess, et cetera. That there are some things, like the idea that all kids need to have a need and should be supported in figuring out their identities as members of society, especially, in our society, that idea, that is true and supported, right, by the literature across many different groups, and that there are some concepts and constructs that you can apply to and really use to assess that, and really like think about that and study it, and that apply, and that idea that it's universally necessary, like that's, and a part of development across many groups, including white youth, right? That's but there are also aspects in the field that don't apply, don't translate, and that definitely should not be, like just, transferred to the experience of white youth, that they just don't make sense. And there are actually constructs that, we haven't talked about this today, but I do research.
How many time?
Oh, we're out of time. Oh, okay.
Yes.
We're
No.
okay.
No,
So let
I
me
just want to say,
thank you.
go for
Okay,
it.
well, say that it's something that we have to work out empirically and theoretically. So it's a great question, and thank you.
Okay, so in our last minute, you can see this is a robust conversation. There were more questions than we were able to answer. So thank you for sending them. I just want to advocate that this is the beginning of a conversation. So the good news is there will be the SRCD constructing the other pre-conference that will continue later this year. We'll also convene in Puerto Rico, May 2nd to 4th in 2022. We encourage you to join the SRCD Commons and submit your incredible work to the Child Development Special Section on the development of anti-racism in children. and to continue to have these conversations, whether that be in your classrooms, around the dinner table, on social media. I'll see you on Twitter. And as a reminder, again, as June Jordan said, we are the ones that we have been waiting for. So go out there and do great things. Thank you so much for coming to today's event.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you,
Thank
Deborah.
you. Thank you.